Xbox admits Japan is a blowout with a 96% lead for PlayStation consoles. This is from Jordan Gerblick over at Games Radar. In defense of its pending acquisition of Activision Blizzard, Microsoft has cited Sony's, quote, remarkable steady console market share, with Japan showing an especially brutal gap between PlayStation and Xbox. Speaking at a press conference with Games Radar Plus attended, Microsoft Vice Chairman Brad Smith addressed concerns from Sony and regulators that Xbox Activision deal is anti-competitive. Quote, think about the market in Europe. It is a market where Sony has an 80% share and Xbox has a 20% share. Globally, it's about 70-30. In Japan, it is 96-4, Smith said. Quote, these numbers have been remarkably steady for 2 decades. Even last year, when there were issues with Sony's supply chain, they came back strong. By our calculation, on a global basis, Sony outsold Microsoft in the fourth quarter by a margin of 69-31, which is pretty much consistent with the global market shares we've seen for 20 years. Smith went on to argue that Sony is fighting to block the Xbox Activision merger in order to protect its leading position in the market. Quote, we understand in some ways it can be tempting when you have an 80% share, hold on as long as possible. I don't think that's what regulators are in the business of doing. They're not here to protect super dominant companies. Microsoft also announced that it's bringing Call of Duty to... Okay, that's from the topic we just had. So, Connor, PlayStation is dominating the world. 60-30 on a good day for Xbox, that is. 94 or 96-4 over in different countries like Japan. This is not... I don't think this is news to anyone who's been paying attention, really. We've always known. But the fact that we have kind of somewhat some like actual numbers, which we haven't gotten from Xbox in a while. I can't remember the last time that they've shared console sales numbers, like in terms of like what PlayStation's doing. In fact, I don't believe they've shared numbers like this since the launch of Xbox One, somewhere around Halo 5 Guardians time, I think is the last time they shared information like this, because they've just been getting fucking dominated by PlayStation for the last 10 plus years, 20 plus years. So PlayStation has always been the dominant force in the industry. And now, you know, as they're trying to sort of block this acquisition from happening, Microsoft is coming out and saying, yo, we have forever been second place to PlayStation. We are not being anti-competitive here. We're just trying our best to do what we can.
I think this might be the best argument they have for allowing them to acquire Activision Blizzard. You know, it makes sense that they have kept these numbers hidden because they don't want to show how, you know, the big disparity between the two big gaming companies. And to the article's point about how Japan has a 96% lead, it makes sense when you realize how many studios are based out of Japan that are made for the PlayStation, that are made by Sony, that are made by Square Enix, which is generally associated with Sony, though it appears on other platforms. So it makes sense that it has a lead, but that's a pretty substantial lead. And I think, you know, once again, strengthens the case for, you know, if Activision Blizzard's just going to get acquired by Microsoft, it's not really going to make that big of a difference if there's this much of a gap between the two companies as it is. And, you know, we haven't really talked about it in a while since there hasn't been really new updates, but once again, they're trying to acquire Blizzard, which on its own has had a variety of different problems. So with that, seeing a large lead in, Sony's lead on PlayStation, Sony's lead on Microsoft, you know, I think we're going to see more and more of this stuff come out that's only going to further strengthen Microsoft's arguments to acquire Activision Blizzard.
Yeah, right there alongside you. Yeah, this is a really strong argument in Microsoft's favor on this particular case. I think it's fascinating that Xbox is willing to be vulnerable to show that they are weaker in order to get this deal to work, which, you know, $69 billion. Yeah, you want to get this deal to work, you know, so that Call of Duty can start, you know, generating a money wheel for you. But some of it is like the jump is actually kind of surprising to me. You know, he talks about the market in Europe. Sony has 80% of the share versus Xbox 80-20. Globally, it's 70-30. That's honestly bigger than I would have expected in specific markets like Europe, like America, in which you would think, you know, platforms like Xbox would be a little more powerful. I think this really just goes to show that when you spend a generation not giving us premier titles during the Xbox One generation, even though Sony did have the lead, has always had the lead. But if they had strategized more on being a premier place for the biggest and best video games, like it looks like they're trying to now, then this wouldn't be a problem. Or at least it wouldn't be as drastic as a problem. You'd probably see a little more, 60-40, 50, 55-45, in specific markets or so forth. But they took their foot off the gas and during the Xbox One generation and instead, tried to sell services and platforms and stuff. And it's crazy that all of these years later, we still see the ripple effect from those decisions. And we still see Xbox just constantly being in second place, all this time by a huge margin. It's not a small amount that they are, losing this, so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I guess.
No, go ahead.
I'm always reminded of the Xbox One and the PS4 when they were coming out. Xbox One had that disastrous PR issue where they were, what was it exactly? It's so long ago. They prevent you wouldn't be able to play games if you didn't.
You had to be online at all times, which looking back now isn't that big of a requirement, even though people are complaining about games like Suicide Squad always needing an online connection or whatever. And you couldn't share games because their DRM was highly restrictive, and that's what it was. You needed an internet connection to play games.
That's what it was.
Through their DRM. So if you were never connected, you couldn't, they couldn't verify your purchase or whatever. They were trying to cut out used sales games because, if a game is being sold at used, it's just the it would just be like the GameStops, the mom and pop shops that would get all revenue from that. They wouldn't have to split revenue from that, which is interesting. And it would just all be stuff like that. So, they were being competitive and greedy, but in different ways and in ways that didn't benefit them in the long term. And they were just, Sony took advantage of that and honestly ran away with the narrative of it. Some of the things that people were saying just weren't 100% true. It really wasn't going to be that dire or drastic or anything, but the way that the narrative was, it was nail in the coffin for that entire generation.
Yeah, and with things like that, it makes sense that Sony has that large lead over Microsoft. And, as you said, without those titles that PlayStation was putting out, or equivalency to that, it only makes sense that they kind of dug this hole as much as they did, considering past actions. So, I really just don't think that PlayStation has that, or Sony, I should say, has that argument against Xbox with all things considered.